Hi everyone, this is Dean Rader. Welcome back to another episode of Poems That Changed Me. Today's poem, The Colonel by Carolyn Forche, changed me very early in my writing career. And if you are of my generation, meaning you're roughly 21, 22 years old, then you know what I'm talking about. Actually, anyone who was an English major or studied poetry in college in the 80s or 90s has likely read this poem. So here's the poem. And you can see that it's written in a prose format. The Colonel, Carolyn Forche. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the window there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground. May 1978. So, I remember reading this poem in college as an undergraduate. I still have my copy of The Country Between Us, the volume which this poem first appeared in. And I remember being sort of astonished by the way the poem looked on the page. It might have been one of the first prose poems I had ever read. And I was struck not only by the way it looked on the page, but also its tone. I had been a journalism major briefly in college. I had gone to college thinking I was going to be a journalist. I had actually written for my hometown newspaper when I was in high school. So I was very struck by the objective tone of this poem. Very journalistic, absence of any emotional language, completely devoid of any sort of drama. Very straightforward, very objective. She actually breaks many of the rules you're taught in beginning creative writing courses. Declarative sentences, repetitive sentence structure, clipped diction and syntax. In fact, the only real use of figurative language is that gorgeous line, "The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house." Beautiful, beautiful line. And what that line does is it makes the other non-figurative, non-metaphorical language of the poem really jump out. So this was one of the first great examples for me of how the tone of the poem can work in concert with the form of the poem, because its prose structure indicates a kind of absence of poemness, right? If it were lineated, vertical, in stanzas, it indicates, from a semiotic perspective, I'm a poem. But in this block pattern, it indicates I'm prose. And we come to prose differently than we come to poetry. Add on to that the absence of any real poetic language, the absence of what we might think of as poem speak, and you have this sort of double de-poemizing of this experience. The other thing that has changed for me, and it's connected to the first thing, is that it has become known as a poem of witness. In fact, I think the success of this poem is really what prompted Forche to put together her phenomenal anthology, Poetry of Witness, which I'm actually using right now in a class I'm teaching. One of the things that's really cool about this poem is how she uses the sight of the poem almost as a camera. It's as if this poem is a very short documentary film, but in text. She uses the sight of the poem not to look inward, not to point the camera inward, but to rotate that poem outward. You'll notice that she never really describes her own shock at seeing the ears on the table and on the floor. I think most of us would have been, oh my God, there were ears. She says very matter-of-factly, he spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. The absence of any theatrical language there or overstatement of her own place in this setting also taught me a lot about the role of the speaker in these kinds of poems. So I wound up being really moved by this poem, not only because it's a use of poetry to call attention to human rights violations, but also because its artistry is exemplified by its lack of overt artistry. This poem changed many things for me, and probably for you too. And I am in debt to Carolyn for this fantastic poem.